Thank you for.
I hope somebody was looking as he was speaking, but in fact it was thing from. Okay, so I suggest we launch the show.
Being here to listen to my talk. I am Javier Morales, a machine learning researcher at the Comcast Corporation. Hello everyone, thank you for being here to listen to my talk. I am Javier Morales, a machine learning researcher at the Comcast Corporation, and today I'm going to present a joint work with Nicolas García Trillos and Félix Morales. So this work is on a family of gradient-based neural architecture search algorithms, and today I'm going to talk about the geometric structure that inspires them. So before we dive into the geometric structure, let me just give you a brief recap about the literature on neural architecture research. So neural networks has been around for a long time, since 1950, and along the decades there have been periods of excitement and then skepticism about the potential of these networks. They call them AI winters. So among the most recent wave of great excitement for this topic it was inspired by this network called AlexNext, and in particular by a competition called the ImageNet competition. So in this competition, several computer science groups try to maximize the accuracy in a database of images and different algorithms for classifying them. So the key contribution of AlexNet was not so much the neural architecture it proposes, but it was the first team that realized that you can actually use GPUs to greatly accelerate the convergence of neural networks. So here you can see a table among the different winners, or like the top 5 best performing groups from 2012 to 2017. So in this competition, actually, the team that is most relevant to this talk is this NASGD team, which was actually a group by Google that basically had the following idea. Well, if neural networks are so powerful and we're trying to find the best possible architecture, why don't we just have a neural network try to design the best possible architecture? And well, that's actually what they did. So they basically, their approach is to use an LSTM type network that is trying to predict the best possible structure on a given family of neural networks that can be serialized on a vocabulary. So their method is very powerful, but it has a big drawback. That is, to get a single data point, you must have a single data point is a neural architecture and the maximal accuracy it reaches after training. So to get a single data point, you must train the network until convergence, which can take several hours. So actually, the main drawback of their method is that they had to use a vast amount of computational resources. They had something like 800 GPUs training for an entire month to actually achieve the optimal architecture. Okay, but the important thing about this is that this paper by Sov and their group was the one that started the whole field of neural architecture search, and since then it has grown to a very vast literature in which there are like three or 5 papers published every month. Okay, so our algorithm is definitely not the fastest one at the moment. I think last time I checked, the fastest one was by the group of Simonayan in DeepMind. It's called like differential architecture search. But one of the most attractive features about our algorithm is that it is inspired by a Riemannian structure, and it is of gradient type. So we think that this could potentially be very useful for other applications. So what you see here is the neural architecture found by our algorithm, and it achieves an accuracy of 3.96 on the CIFAR10 dataset, which is the same dataset in which the NAS group, the soft group, attacked the problem on their first work. And the accuracy is not that far, and it can achieve it with a single GPU in 1 day. Of course, this is like 5 years after their paper, so of course it's not like it's not a fair comparison. And yes, as I said, this is not the fastest method in the literature. Okay, so now I'd like to focus on motivating the geometrical structure that inspire our family of algorithms. So as I said, they are gradient based, so that means that they can be interpreted as a gradient descent. So what is a gradient descent? So gradient descent is one of the main optimization tools that people have for training neural networks. So in that framework, you have an energy that is the loss function of the network, and then you have an initial state, which is the state of parameters in which the network is initialized, and then you evolve those parameters in the opposite direction of the gradient of the energy, and this will reduce the value of the energy, and hopefully you will converge to a low energy point that may not be the minimum. In practice, you actually do like stochastic gradient descent because it's computationally more viable, but I'm going to ignore those technical points. Okay, so what we want then is to do a gradient descent in the space of all neural networks. So this is actually a bit not so straightforward because you don't have a natural notion of gradient in the space of neural networks. So to actually do a gradient descent, there is like 3 minimal things you need. First, you need a space. Second, you need an energy. And third, you need a distance. If you have those 3 things, then you can sort of do a gradient descent. So what is our space? Our space is a space of probability measures over all neural networks. And we endow the space of all neural networks with a graph structure. When we say that 2 networks are connected, if their structure is similar enough. And of course, this is sort of like an open, the exact connectivity condition can be calibrated, and different choices will give you different spaces. So we have the space, and we have a natural energy. So the natural energy will be like just the expected value of the loss function of the probability density along all of the neural networks. So the only thing that we're missing is a distance. Fortunately, there is a very popular notion of distance among probability measures, which is the Wasserstein distance. So the Wasserstein distance between 2 probability measures can be defined as the curve of minimal kinetic energy. It can be defined as the minimal kinetic energy solution of the continuity equation that at time 0 is in the source measure mu, and at time 1 is in the target measure nu. Okay. So this is the Benamou-Brenier formulation of the Wasserstein distance. Now, how can you use the Wasserstein distance to define a gradient flow in the space of probability measures? Well, for that, let us go back for Rn for a second. Okay. So if you're trying to approximate a gradient descent numerically, you can set the discrete velocity to be equal to the opposite of the gradient. Now here you have 2 choices. You could evaluate the gradient at the initial point or at the final point. If you evaluate it at the initial point, then you're doing a direct Euler method. If you're doing it at the final point, then you're doing an implicit Euler method. For our purposes, the implicit Euler method is going to be more useful because when you choose the final point, then you can restate this approximate scheme as a minimization problem. So it turns out that equation 1 is equivalent to the target point x at time tau being a minimizer of the function of this function here. Okay? And you can check that. You can check that if you take the gradient of this and you set it equal to 0, you get precisely the implicit Euler equation. Now the advantage is that then we have removed the gradient from the picture, and this is just the distance between the initial point and the final point. So you can just replace the distance in RD with the Wasserstein distance. And it turns out that when you do this and you follow, you send the time step to 0, then you get this equation that is called the Fokker-Plan equation. And so this was presented for the first time by Jordan Kellendeler and Otto, and it gave like a variational formulation of the Fokker-Plan equation, and it interpreted as a gradient flow. Now, one of the most interesting things more interesting insights that Félix Otto was able to provide was after this work, and then their subsequent ones on the porous medium equation, is that actually you can use the Wasserstein distance to give a geometrical interpretation as a Riemannian manifold on the space of probability measures endowed by this distance. So in there you can identify the tangent space to a measure in terms of functions, in terms of potentials. So you say that a curve has a velocity given by the potential if it solves the continuity equation, and then you define this metric tensor, and then the Wasserstein distance can just be identified in terms of like the minimal kinetic energy connecting the 2 points, where the kinetic energy is actually computed by the metric tensor. Now you can actually use that to give a more intuitive intuition of why the Fokker-Plan equation is the gradient flow of relative entropy. So if we do a quick computation, you know that in a Riemannian manifold, if you take the derivative of the energy along a given curve, you get the product between the gradient of the energy and the velocity. So if you repeat that computation in the Otto formalism, let's say that you take the relative entropy and you take the derivative along a given tangent vector at phi, you get precisely the inner product between the tangent vector and this function, and then you can sort of interpret that this function is the gradient of the entropy. So if you put it back on the continuity equation, following the definition of the velocity of a curve, then you get precisely the Fokker-Plan equation. Okay, so in our case, we're working on a product of RD. So we're working on probability of a product of RD times the graph of architectures. So what we're missing then is also a notion of tangent vectors in the space of the probability measures over a graph, and unfortunately this was studied by several groups, Mas and Liero are one of the key contributors, and they, following the Otto intuition, they can define a distance on a graph, on the Wasserstein distance on the measures of a graph, again as the minimal solution of the minimal kinetic energy solution of the continuity equation, and they're able to identify tangent planes in terms of potentials as well. So our space is just the product space. So the probability measures of G times RD, and then we just consider the continuity equation of the product, and basically we're able to recover the tangent plane as and characterize it in terms of potentials. Moreover, then we have like a geometrical structure on this space, we characterize geodesics and so forth, and we can also characterize the gradient of the relative entropy by following the precise same intuition. So if you take the derivative of the energy along at a given potential, then you get the inner product between the potential log f plus v. So if you plug it back on the continuity equation in the product, you get a system of reaction diffusion equations. That is in turn the analog of the Fokker-Plan equation in our space. So here, to define continuity equation on a graph, you need a mobility along edges, which is this ft, and different choices of f will give you different metrics. So actually we can do a bit more than that. We're able to recover a Jordan, Kellendeler, and Otto type theorem, for which if you choose a particular metric that is a particular mobility, the one given in here, then we're able to show that for that mobility we can find a Wasserstein type cost, now more in the Brenier discrete formulation, such that if you follow the minimizing movement scheme of that cost, you converge to the Fokker-Plan equation. So this is the Jordan, Kellendeler, and Otto-like result in our context. So our algorithm actually takes this equation here and it approximates it by a particle system that runs on the product space of the graph. So that is the graph of architectures G times parameters are D. So these particles then, they evolve mimicking this equation, and those are trying to minimize the expected loss in the space of all architectures. And we have a paper that describes the process in detail, and we get reasonable values of accuracy in reasonable amount of time. So well, I think that's all I can say with the time given. So thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation, and let me see if there are questions online. That doesn't really, unless I'm really watching the wrong window. Yes, and now I get the floor to the room. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I would like to ask about the Wasserstein problem in the graph case. My question is, are the two formulations, the static one based on the distance, on the graph distance, and the dynamic one based on the continuity equation on the graph, actually equivalent in this case? Or the equivalence also only in the continuous space? Thank you.
Hi, yes, so in the graph, to my knowledge, we only have like a continuous like distance. Actually, this discrete Brenier-like distance that we formulate is actually well formulated in the product space, and the equivalence is actually not known. Like, we're actually trying to prove a notion of equivalence, but this is sort of an open problem. And the discrete distance that we use for the minimizing movement scheme is definitely not equivalent to the continuous one. But we're trying to find a discrete one that will actually be equivalent. It's an open problem.
Thank you. Is there any other question? I have a small question. You say in the paper that you have experimented your method to find the optimal architecture for a given training problem. Which kind of training problem have you investigated?
Yes, for sure. So again, so one of the most popular problems for competing architectures is this ImageNet competition, in which you're trying to classify images. So this was mostly focused on networks that are designed for image classification, that they follow a very specific structure that is of convolutional type. So that's where it was tested. But the algorithm is sort of more general, and it can probably be applied to several optimization problems that are of semi-discrete type. That is, you have like a discrete component on the problem and a continuous component of the problem. So the discrete component will be like the architecture of the network, and the continuous component are the parameters inside the network in this case.
Because you could have tried on problem for which you know what is optimal architecture. I have an example in mind. You just, as a training problem, you want to mimic an algorithm, but you know. So there is an optimal architecture which implement with optimal weight the algorithm. For example, finding the max on a sequence of 1,000 numbers. So you know what is the optimal architecture, and then you will know if your methodology goes to this optimal architecture.
Actually, like, no, these are like very relaxed concepts. So I wouldn't say that we know that there is an optimal architecture. And in fact, like, the benchmark for the maximal accuracy keeps getting better and better each year. So I don't think that anybody has found an optimal architecture yet. It's much that year people compete to improve.
For the problem, the kind of problem I was just suggesting, you know in advance what is the optimal architecture. And my question is to train your methodology to see if you find this architecture. For image, we don't know the optimal architecture, but for a stupid algorithm, you know the optimal architecture. Just how to implement the algorithm with a neural network. And my question was that to see if you can find this optimal architecture when you know it, but not the fact. My question was not if we do we know the optimal architecture for image finding? It's different. Okay, thanks. It was just a question.
Yes, I think I understand your question. You're asking whether we converge to the global minimizer or not. And I think that it's possible that with probability 1 we do. Yeah, but that will have to be proven.
Yes, it's just a suggestion for the work, not a criticism. Okay, thank you.
Actually, your question.
Yes.
Yes, another question. Sorry, I thought that there was no question. So
it might be a little bit. You might have already described it, but you're making a space of all neural networks. You've got so you've got a distance, but I don't understand the actual space. How do you define the space? Do you have like grouped actions on the space that you use? Because you're getting space of neural networks. So could you explain that a little bit for me? Did that make sense?
Yes, for sure. Yeah. So basically, the way that we model this space is that first you have like so you have a collection of all possible architectures, but those architectures inside they have parameters. Okay. So a single architecture could have different values for the parameters on that architecture. So you encode all of the parameters in an RD space, but then you have like the discrete component, which are all of the several architectures. So then you have to define a notion of similarity between architectures. So you basically draw this graph in a way that two architectures that you consider similar enough are connected. So this is why we work on the space RD times G, and then we just consider the space of probability measures over that base space, because the space of probability measures has a natural distance, whereas the base space doesn't have such a natural distance.
Thank you.
Thank you. But just to tell the people online that when the people come to ask a question, they cannot stay long on the desk, so they are not turning their back to your answer because of the problem of the sanitary problem. They have to go back to their seat. Okay, thank you very much for your answer, and
thank you.
And now the next talk will be about the last news about the NCV tensor that we are all very anxious to know. And